the sisters who were related to each other and made their parents disappear. In 1894, people whispered about Clara and Maeve Blackwood, two young women who were stuck in a crumbling mansion in Alabama. They looked so much alike that people couldn't tell them apart. The sisters sat calmly at the dinner table and said their parents had just gone on a trip when they disappeared without a trace. But Dr. Alistair Finch saw something else in their empty stares that made him feel cold. He found a secret room in the basement with deep scratch marks on the walls. The sheriff of the town wouldn't listen. The neighbors turned away, and slowly the terrible truth began to come out. A true story about what really happened in that scary house, and why the whole community chose to stay quiet instead of seeking justice. But who decides what justice looks like when the victims turn into killers? The summer of 1894 settled over Blackwood Hollow like a thick, suffocating shroud in the Alabama heat. It had only been 3 months since Dr. Alistair Finch had come to this godforsaken place. His medical degree from Johns Hopkins was still in its frame, but his northern sensibilities were already fading under the weight of southern superstition. The town doctor before him had died suddenly, they said, of heart failure. But the people there talked about curses and family feuds with the same certainty they used in Sunday sermons. Alistair's office was in the middle of town, in a small building between the general store and the funeral home. This seemed fitting, given how sick his patients were. Most of them had problems that could have been avoided with better sanitation and education, but when he suggested these changes, people looked at him with suspicion and muttered about northern interference. The Blackwood family was like a cancer that spread through everything. Their plantation covered thousands of acres, and their power reached every part of public life. The only other time he had seen them was that awful August morning when the patriarch, Jebediah, walked through the town square with his skeletal wife. It seemed like his very presence sucked warmth out of the air. 2 young women followed them so closely that Alistair blinked twice to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. The local gossips told him that Clara and Maeve Blackwood were sisters, born 2 years apart, but looked exactly the same, like 2 people looking at each other in still water. Clara, the older one, walked with a stiff, disciplined air, while Maeve floated next to her like a ghost, her eyes never quite focusing on the world around her. Sheriff Brody knocked on Alistair's door before dawn on August 15. His fist hit the door with the urgency of a man who wanted this problem to go away as soon as possible. The sheriff was in his 42nd and had seen a lot of things. His badge was more tarnished than polished, and he didn't get his power from being fair. He got it from being willing to look the other way when it was good for the town's powerful families. "Doc, you need to come to Blackwood Place," Brody said without any small talk. "Something's not right up there." The ride through the dark before dawn seemed to go on forever. Their horses' hooves clattered against the dirt road that went through cotton fields and slave quarters that still housed sharecroppers decades after emancipation. The Blackwood mansion appeared out of the morning fog like something from a fever dream. Its Greek Revival columns were stained from years of neglect, and its wraparound porch was sagging under the weight of rotting wood. As they got closer, Sheriff Brody explained what was going on in short sentences. A sharecropper had come to town the night before and said he hadn't seen Jebediah or Elizabeth Blackwood in 3 days. The overseer was worried enough to go to the main house and check on things. He found the front door unlocked and the family's normal routine was off. The sisters stayed, but their parents had disappeared without a word. Alistair's medical training couldn't quite explain how wrong the inside of the mansion felt to him right away. The table in the formal dining room was set for 4 people, and the plates of food on it were in different stages of decay, which made it look like a meal had been interrupted days before. Flies buzzed around the congealed gravy and moldy bread rolls, and crystal glasses held the last drops of wine that had turned into vinegar. Everything else looked like it had been carefully cared for. There wasn't a book out of place in the library or a cushion out of place in the parlor. It was as if someone had worked hard to keep up the appearance of normalcy while letting this one scene of abandonment grow. They found Clara and Maeve in the morning room, sitting next to each other on a velvet sofa that had seen better decades. The sheriff's records say that Clara was 22 years old. She was so beautiful that men were uncomfortable around her because she was too sharp, too knowing, and too controlled. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a tight, shiny knot, and her green eyes followed Alistair's every move with deadly accuracy. Mave, who was 20 years old, looked like she had been carved from the same mold, but she was softer in some way, as if life had worn away her edges instead of sharpening them. Her identical features had a dreamy quality that made it seem like her mind was wandering in far-off places. "Miss Clara, Miss Maeve," Sheriff Brody said in a very polite way. "This is Dr. Finch. We're trying to figure out where your parents might have gone." Clara's answer came easily, like someone who had practiced for this conversation. "Papa said he would take Mama to see her sister in Mobile. She's been sick lately. And he thought the sea air might help her health." Her voice had the refined tone of someone who had gone to a fancy school, but there was something harder underneath. Steel, wrapped in silk. Allister looked at both women with the eyes of a doctor, taking in details that made his skin crawl. They looked so much alike that it was more than just normal sibling resemblance. It was like they were from the same family for generations. The way their skulls were shaped, where their eyes were, and how their mouths curved all had the small signs he had learned to look for in his medical studies. Inbreeding is common in small rural communities, but it rarely had such strong effects without causing major developmental issues. "When did they leave?" he asked, his professional curiosity getting the better of his social niceties. Maeve spoke for the first time, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Doctor, time moves strangely in this house. Days blend together like watercolors in the rain." Her sister's hand shot out to grab Maeve's wrist. It wasn't gentle, but it was quick and firm, like she had done it a lot before. "What my sister means is that we've been so worried about Mama's health that we haven't been keeping careful track of the hours. 3 days, perhaps 4. The explanation sounded rehearsed and had been polished smooth by being said over and over. Allister's attention was drawn to their hands. Clara's grip on her sister's wrist made her knuckles turn white. Maeve's fingers wrapped around a small wooden thing that looked like it was made by hand. Their nails were clean but short, and both of their palms and forearms had small scars that looked like they had been hurting themselves for years. Sheriff Brody seemed eager to believe their story and leave, but Allister's medical training had taught him to look beyond what was on the surface. Something about the way they acted, the way they explained things, and the way they looked too much alike made him suspicious. He had seen trauma before in his brief practice. The hollow eyes of abused children, the careful postures of women who had learned to make themselves small. And these sisters radiated both vulnerability and danger in equal measure. Allister saw that Maeve's grip on her small wooden treasure was getting weaker as they got ready to leave. It was a bird carved out of something that looked like pine with surprising skill. Its wings were spread out like it was flying. When their eyes met, she quickly pressed it against her chest and then tucked it back into her skirts. It was such a quick move that he almost missed it, but it was full of desperate meaning. Sheriff Brody clearly wanted the ride back to town to be over with, as it was very quiet. But Allister's mind was full of questions that grew like bacteria in a petri dish. Where were Elizabeth and Jebediah Blackwood? Why did their daughters seem so calm about their parents' disappearance? What secrets were hidden in that old, falling-down mansion that could make 2 young women look more like twins than sisters? Allister had made a choice that would change everything by the time they got to town. He would not let this mystery go, no matter what the sheriff or the townspeople wanted. Something awful had happened in the Blackwood house, and those 2 strange, beautiful, broken sisters were the only ones who could explain it. The question was if he was ready for the horror that key might let him in on. The first thing that made it hard to understand the Blackwood mystery wasn't the sisters themselves, but the wall of silence that surrounded their family name. Allister learned that asking questions about the Blackwoods was like poking an infected wound in the 3 days after his visit to the mansion. Every question was met with winces, evasions, and nervous laughter that showed how scared they were. Whenever Allister talked about the family, the general storekeeper suddenly had important things to do in his stockroom. When asked about Jebediah, the barber's hands shook so badly that he almost cut a customer's throat. The minister, who was supposed to be a man of God and truth, said he didn't know anything more than anyone else. However, when he spoke, his eyes kept going to the church's collection plate. Allister's anger grew as he saw how much power the Blackwood family had in this town. Jebediah was in charge of not only the biggest plantation in the county, but also the money that kept almost every family in Blackwood Hollow alive. His cotton fields provided work for dozens of sharecroppers, most of them former slaves, who had nowhere else to turn in the decades following emancipation. The general store gave people credit based on how much cotton they thought they would be able to grow. The local bank held mortgages backed by land that was next to Blackwood property. Blackwood money, Blackwood power, and, it seems, Blackwood fear ran through every thread of the town's fabric. Dr. Harrison's medical files provided the first glimpse behind the curtain of respectability. Allister got not only his predecessor's practice, but also the well-kept records that went with it. And those records showed a disturbing picture of the Blackwood family's health history. Harrison had carefully written down Elizabeth's injuries as domestic accidents. She had broken ribs that didn't heal well, bruises that looked like fingers and fists, and burns that couldn't have been caused by accidents in the kitchen. In the months leading up to Harrison's death, the entries became more frequent and severe, with notes that said a woman's spirit was slowly being crushed by the weight of systematic violence. The notes about the daughters were even more worrisome. Harrison had looked at Clara and Mave many times over the years, and his notes included things that made Alistair's medical training shudder in horror. References to family problems and strange body parts suggested tests that no good doctor would have ordered unless they thought the worst kind of abuse was going on. The last entry, written just 2 weeks before Harrison's sudden death, had a single line that sent chills down Alistair's spine: the household secrets that would destroy men's souls. God forgive me for my silence. Alistair was determined to find someone who would break that silence, so he turned his attention to the sharecroppers who worked on the Blackwood plantation. These men and women were already on the fringes of society, so they had nothing to lose if the Blackwood family went missing, and maybe a lot to gain. But when he got close to the group of rundown cabins where the plantation workers lived, he felt a fear so deep that it seemed to come from the ground itself. Joshua, an old man who used to be a slave, was the first person Alistair talked to. When he saw Alistair's medical bag, he backed away, as if it had snakes in it. "Don't know nothing about the big house, doctor. Don't want to know nothing, neither." When Alistair kept asking, Joshua's weathered face crumpled with what might have been pity. "Some people aren't missing, doctor. Some people have just finally gone where they were supposed to go." Rebecca, Joshua's granddaughter, was the first person to break the silence. She caught Alistair as he was leaving the quarters, but her voice was so low that the cicadas outside couldn't hear it. "Are you looking for the truth about that family? You talked to Sarah Washington. She used to work at the big house before they sent her away. She lives in that little cabin past the creek where the road splits off toward town." Her eyes darted nervously toward the plantation house, which was visible in the distance, like a monument to evil. "But doctor, when you find what you're looking for, you should remember that some truths are too heavy for one person to bear." Sarah Washington was a woman in her 42nd, with graying hair and hands that were permanently stained from cleaning, cooking, and pretending to be respectable for people who weren't. She lived alone in a cabin that was clean, but sparse. She took care of all of her things because she couldn't afford to replace anything on the small amount of money she made washing clothes for the town's poorer families. When Alistair told her what he wanted, she reacted right away, and strongly. She shook her head before he was done talking and backed away from the door as if he had a disease that could spread. "I don't talk about that house, doctor. Talking about that house is how people die. Go missing, or worse." Her voice was heavy with the weight of having lived through violence, and she spoke carefully, like someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest changes of expression or tone. "Leave those questions alone. If you don't, they'll leave you alone forever." But Alistair had come this far and wasn't going to let threats stop him. He pushed his case with the desperate urgency of a man who felt time was running out. He talked about his medical oath, his duty to help people who couldn't help themselves, and his belief that whatever happened in that house was still going on. Sarah's resistance slowly began to break down, not because of his arguments, but because of something deeper. She was too tired to keep secrets that were too terrible to bear alone. "Mr. Jebediah," she said, her voice so low that Alistair had to lean in to hear. "He wasn't like other men. Other men might hit a woman out of anger or take liberties when they've been drinking. But Mr. One, Jebediah, he did things slowly and on purpose, like he was studying the best way to break something precious just to watch it fall apart. She stopped, twisting her hands in her apron as if the fabric could hold her in the present. Miss Elizabeth, poor thing. She stopped being a person at some point. She became more like a doll he kept around to remind himself how to hurt something beautiful. When Sarah started talking about Clara and Mave, the really scary things came out. Jebediah's control over his daughters had been absolute and perverse, treating them not as children to be raised, but as possessions to be shaped according to his twisted vision. He had kept them isolated from other children, educated them himself with lessons that mixed academic subjects with psychological manipulation, and gradually molded them into mirror images of each other in ways that went far beyond their natural resemblance. They weren't allowed to be different people, Sarah said, her weathered cheeks now streaming with tears. Had to dress the same, talk the same, even think the same thoughts. If one of them showed any sign of being her own person, he'd punish both of them until they remembered they was just pieces of him, not real girls at all. She described a household where love had been weaponized, where affection was doled out as reward for compliance and withdrawn as punishment for independence, where two young women had learned that survival meant becoming extensions of their father's will rather than individuals with their own desires and dreams. The last part of Sarah's testimony explained why she had been let go from the Blackwood home. In the weeks before her termination, she had witnessed Jebediah's treatment of his daughters escalating beyond psychological control into territory that made her physically ill to recall. What he was doing to those girls, she whispered, unable to look Alistair in the eye, wasn't natural, wasn't right, and wasn't something any decent person could stand by and watch. I tried to tell Miss Elizabeth, tried to make her see what was happening under her own roof, but she was so broke by then that she couldn't even hear me anymore. Sarah's firing had come out of the blue, with threats that went beyond her own safety to include her whole family. Jebediah had made it clear that anyone who tried to tell stories about the Blackwood family would face consequences that went far beyond one former employee. The message was received and understood, which added to the family's cone of silence about their private matters. As Alistair walked back to town through the dark, with Sarah's words ringing in his ears, he started to see how big the problem really was. This wasn't just a case of a missing person, or even a simple murder investigation. It was a planned, decades-long destruction of human souls that was protected by money, power, and the community's willful blindness. He no longer wondered what had happened to Jebediah and Elizabeth Blackwood. Instead, he wondered if anyone could blame their daughters for what they had done to finally get out of their horrible prison. Sarah Washington's revelations weighed on Alistair like a fever, turning his investigation from a professional duty into a personal crusade that took up all of his waking hours and ruined his dreams. Sleep was hard to come by, and when it did, it was broken up by visions of two young women trapped in a mansion that was more like a lab for degrading people than a home. His medical practice started to suffer because he couldn't focus during exams. His mind kept going back to questions of psychological damage, physical evidence, and the terrible math of survival that had ruled the Blackwood household for decades. The town's response to his ongoing questions changed from being unfriendly to being openly hostile very quickly. Patients started canceling appointments without giving a reason. Their excuses were clear, and their fear was real. The general storekeeper began to charge him too much for basic items, saying there were shortages that magically went away when other customers came in. When they passed each other on the street, even the local minister avoided looking at Alistair, as if being near him might somehow hurt his reputation in the community. The loneliness weighed heavily on him, but it also made his resolve stronger. If everyone in town would rather hear comfortable lies than uncomfortable truths, then he would have to do this investigation on his own, going wherever the evidence led, no matter how much it cost him personally. His first step was to go back to the Blackwood mansion. This time, he wasn't just going along with the sheriff. He was a determined investigator ready to find out what secrets the house might hold. In the late afternoon light, the mansion's decaying grandeur seemed to take on an almost evil quality, as if it knew he had changed his mind. The same table setting in the dining room stayed the same, but the food that was rotting was now crawling with bugs that added their buzzing chorus to the oppressive silence. This time, though, Alcester moved through the house with methodical precision, using his medical training to figure out what was wrong. Each room told a story of control taken to dangerous levels. Furniture arranged with military precision, personal items missing except when they were needed for decoration, and an overwhelming feeling that everyone who lived in these walls had had their sense of self taken away from them. The library was especially revealing because its shelves were full of books that showed what Jebediah liked to read. Medical books about anatomy and inheritance were next to philosophical books about racial hierarchy and the importance of bloodline purity. Religious books stressed submission and obedience, while historical books praised the Antebellum South social order with the same passion as lost cause mythology. The journals were the most disturbing. They were dozens of leather-bound books that kept track of Jebediah's ideas about family structure, genetic inheritance, and how young women should grow up under the guidance of a father. Alcester's hands shook as he read parts that talked about experiments in behavioral conditioning, observations about how easily young minds can be changed, and clinical descriptions of ways to make sure everyone follows the rules. These weren't just the random thoughts of a crazy person. They were the carefully recorded work of a man who had planned the destruction of his family with the same level of care that other men might use to improve farming or run a business. The last entries, which were written just weeks before he went missing, showed that Jebediah's control over his daughters had reached a peak that even he knew couldn't last. The cellar called to him with the promise of answers, and Alcester went down into its depths with his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird. The main area had the usual junk from plantation life, like old furniture, farming tools, and the trash that had built up over the years. But as he carefully looked around, he found something that made his medical training recoil in horror. A secret room behind what looked like a solid stone wall, only accessible through a narrow opening that looked like a crack in the foundation. The room beyond was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, and the walls showed clear signs of human desperation. Deep scratches in the stone told stories of fingernails ripped off in vain attempts to escape, and darker stains on the floor suggested that people had used the bathroom while they were locked up. The only source of light and air was a small window high up in the wall that was barred with iron. The chains that were bolted to the walls at heights that matched Clara and Maeve Blackwood's heights were the most terrifying. The discovery put to rest any doubts about the nature of Jebediah's relationship with his daughters. This was not just psychological abuse or even regular physical violence. It was years of planned torture meant to break people's spirits so completely that they couldn't even think about fighting back. Alcester was sickened by the smell of human suffering in the room. His body rejected the evidence, even as his mind tried to understand what it meant. With this physical proof of the terrible things that happened in the Blackwood house, Alcester went back to town, determined to make Sheriff Brodie do something. But the sheriff's response was even worse than expected. Instead of being shocked or angry at the evidence of systematic abuse, Brodie listened with the tired look of a man who had long suspected something but chose to ignore it. Brodie said, "That room doesn't prove anything about what happened to Jebediah," and his tone made it sound like he thought the conversation was over. Could be they used it for storing things. Or maybe old Jebediah had some unusual disciplinary methods with his daughters. Ain't no law against a father correcting his children, even if his methods seem harsh to outsiders. The sheriff's casual dismissal of torture as mere discipline revealed the depth of moral rot that had infected not just the Blackwood family, but the entire power structure of the community. Alcester was so angry that he couldn't take it anymore and decided to confront the sisters directly. If the authorities wouldn't do anything about the evidence of their suffering, maybe he could get Clara and Maeve to speak up for themselves and break the silence that kept their tormentor's memory alive, and maybe even their own freedom. On a hot August afternoon, he went back to the mansion and found them in the same morning room where they had first met, sitting on the same velvet settee as if they hadn't moved in the weeks since. This time, though, their carefully maintained calm was starting to show signs of cracking, which made it seem like the stress of keeping up the lie was getting to them. Clara's hands shook almost imperceptibly as she poured tea with mechanical precision. Maeve's vacant stare seemed to focus and unfocus, like someone trying to stay present in a conversation that might break her fragile grip on sanity. When Alcester told the women what he had found in the cellar, they both stopped moving, and their breathing was so shallow that it was hard to hear. Alcester said in a soft but firm voice, "I know what he did to you. I know about the room, the years of abuse, and how he controlled every part of your lives. No one would blame you for fighting back against such horrible treatment, no matter what happened to your parents or what you thought you had to do to protect yourselves." His words had an immediate and terrible effect. Clara's carefully crafted facade fell apart like a dam letting in floodwaters. Her face twisted with rage so deep and primal that Alcester instinctively stepped back. "You don't know what we went through," she hissed. Her cultured accent slipped and something harder and more desperate came through. "You think you can just walk into our lives with your medical degree and your northern righteousness and know what it means to live in hell?" But Maeve's answer really scared him to the core. The younger sister, who had seemed so weak and out of touch with reality, suddenly looked at him with eyes that were as clear as broken glass. "He made the silence," she said, her voice full of truth. "But we wrote the end." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession and a challenge. It confirmed Allister's worst fears and showed him how morally complicated things would be for the rest of his life. He didn't find innocent victims. He found survivors who had chosen the most extreme form of self-defense against an enemy who gave them no other choice. The question that still needed to be answered was not whether they had killed their parents, but whether anyone with a working conscience could condemn them for it. Allister couldn't stop thinking about what Maeve had said. Each time he heard it, he fell deeper into a moral abyss that his medical training had never prepared him to deal with. He made the silence, but we made the ending. This simple statement had many meanings that unfolded like a poisonous flower, revealing truths about justice, survival, and the terrible math of human endurance that made him question everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. After the fight, Alcester couldn't eat, sleep, or even focus on the simplest things he had to do every day. His mind kept going over and over the possible consequences of what he had found. His rational mind, which had been trained in science and the law, insisted that murder was murder, no matter what the reason or provocation. Jebediah and Elizabeth Blackwood, no matter what they did to their daughters, were people with legal rights that included protection from vigilante justice. The right thing to do would be to tell higher-ups about what he found, to use the legal system to get justice, and to believe that the system would take into account the unusual circumstances that led two young women to such desperate actions. Even as these thoughts came to him, Alcester knew they were lies, meant to keep his faith in institutions that had already shown themselves to be beyond saving. The other part of his mind, the part that had seen the scratch marks in that underground room and heard Sarah Washington's testimony about systematic torture, told him different things. What kind of justice could you expect from a system that let Jebediah Blackwood abuse his family for decades without doing anything? What court would give two women a fair hearing when their very existence went against social norms about family structure and bloodline purity? What jury from Blackwood Hollow would have the guts to convict a man whose wealth had such a big impact on their whole community even after he died? As a doctor, he was worried about the physical symptoms that started to show up because of the moral weight of his knowledge. His hands started to shake all the time, which made it almost impossible to do delicate medical procedures. He had such bad headaches that he couldn't see clearly for hours at a time. He lost all of his appetite, and his clothes started to hang loosely on a frame that was losing weight at an alarming rate. He didn't feel better after sleeping. Instead, he had nightmares in which he walked through endless hallways filled with torture chambers. Each one had victims whose faces looked like those of Clara and Maeve Blackwood. The isolation that had started with his investigation grew into something like total social quarantine. His few remaining patients stopped coming altogether, so most of his medical practice was just taking care of his own worsening mental health. The people of the town crossed the street instead of saying hello to him. This made him think that word of his discoveries had gotten out, even though he had tried to keep them secret. Even the simplest business transactions turned into acts of hostility, with shopkeepers acting like his presence made their stores dirty. Allister began to see the true genius of Jebediah Blackwood's system of control when things were at their worst. The man didn't just hurt his family in private. He also built a network of people who helped him do it, that spread throughout the whole community. Everyone who chose to ignore clear signs of abuse, every authority figure who refused to look into injuries that seemed suspicious, and every neighbor who accepted easy explanations for strange behavior, had all become accomplices to decades of torture by closing their eyes. It would mean admitting their own moral guilt to admit that what happened in the Blackwood mansion was true, which is too terrible for most people to bear. The news made Allister look for Sarah Washington again, not as an investigator looking for clues, but as a desperate man looking for a way to make sense of the impossible moral situation he was now in. He saw her working in a small garden behind her cabin. She moved slowly and purposefully, as if she had learned how to find meaning in simple tasks through hard work. When she looked up and saw him coming, her face showed both sympathy and maybe recognition, as if she had been expecting him to come for a while. "You found what you were looking for," she said, not asking. "And now you wish you hadn't." Allister's chest felt like it was breaking apart when she said how accurate her assessment was. He told her everything. The torture chamber, the fight with the sisters, the horrible certainty that they had killed their parents, and the impossible burden of knowing what to do with that information. Sarah listened without stopping, and her rough hands never stopped working among the vegetables that were her small claim to independence and dignity. "Doctor," she said finally, her voice full of the authority of someone who had been through things that most people couldn't even imagine. "You think there's some kind of justice to be found in all this, but you're looking in the wrong place. Justice isn't about punishment or courts or making sure bad people get what they deserve. It's about stopping the hurt from continuing and making sure the suffering doesn't just pass on to the next generation like some kind of terrible inheritance." End quote. Her words gave Allister a new way of looking at things that changed how he thought about his moral duties. Maybe the question wasn't whether Clara and Maeve Blackwood should be punished for what they did, but whether exposing them would do anything other than follow the rules of the law. The sisters had escaped a life of abuse that had defined their whole lives, but their freedom was fragile and could be taken away by the same justice system that had failed to protect them in the first place. The last piece of information that Allister needed to fully understand the tragedy came from Sarah's next revelation. She had seen not only the systematic abuse of Clara and Maeve while she lived with the Blackwoods, but also their desperate attempts to keep each other safe from their father's worst behavior. People who weren't sisters might think that their bond was strange or unhealthy, but it was actually their main way of staying alive. It was a shared strength that helped them get through things that would have killed either of them alone. Sarah said, "Those girls learned how to share the pain." She was crying as she remembered things that had haunted her for years. When Mr. Jebediah got mad at one of them, the other would find ways to get his attention and make herself the target instead. They took turns being strong for each other and broken so the other could heal. What looks like strangeness to people who don't understand is really just love that is desperate because of things no child should ever have to deal with. The picture of two young women switching between being a victim and a protector, sharing the burden of survival in ways that went beyond normal sibling relationships, finished Allister's moral change. These weren't heartless killers who had killed parents who got in their way. They were broken people who had finally found the strength to break a cycle of violence that had been going on for their whole lives. If you could call it a crime, it was an act of freedom that would free not only them, but also future generations from having to go through what they had gone through. As Allister walked back through the gathering dusk toward his lonely practice, he felt the terrible weight of knowledge starting to change into something that might one day become wisdom. He couldn't change the terrible things that had happened to Clara and Maeve Blackwood, give them back their stolen childhoods, or heal the mental scars that would last them the rest of their lives. But he could decide what to do with the truth he had found. Could decide if justice meant punishment or protection, and if his promise to do no harm went beyond treating physical illnesses to include keeping people free from torture that had been going on for a long time. Allister finally saw a way forward that honored both his professional duties and his human conscience after Maeve had said those chilling words. He could serve the truth without helping to further victimization of people who had already suffered too much. Alistair's change in attitude didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly over time, like a river changing course through constant erosion instead of a sudden flood. He used to try to reveal the truth no matter what, but now he was starting to think about how that truth could be used as a weapon for protection instead of destruction. His medical training had taught him that sometimes the best way to treat a wound was to accept that it would never fully heal and find ways to keep it from getting worse. The Blackwood sisters were an example of this. They were survivors whose recovery didn't depend on justice in the usual sense, but on keeping the fragile freedom they had finally claimed for themselves. His first real action was to carefully destroy evidence that could be used against Clara and Mauvais. On a cold September evening, Dr. Harrison's medical records, which had strange notes about exams that hinted at systematic abuse, ended up in his fireplace. The flames burned years of documented pain, and Alistair threw the ashes to the wind behind his practice. Jebediah's journals from the mansion library came next. Their clinical descriptions of psychological experiments and behavioral conditioning were reduced to smoke and memory. The torture chamber's physical evidence was still there, but Alistair made sure that no official report would ever lead investigators to its discovery by carefully recording its location and condition in his own private records. The legal problems with the Blackwood estate gave people an unexpected chance to help in a more positive way. Since both parents were missing and presumed dead, their large estate had to go through a complicated probate process that could take years while lawyers and distant relatives fought over the money. Alistair had kept in touch with a few of his former medical school classmates who had gone on to become lawyers. By asking questions that sounded like intellectual curiosity, he began to figure out how to use inheritance law to his advantage. A lawyer friend in Mobile who worked with rich families on estate planning gave me the most important piece of advice. He said that in cases where parents went missing and there was no clear proof of death, the law generally assumed they had died after 7 years. But if the missing people had young children or other dependents, the courts could appoint guardians to take care of the estate until the missing people were found. This would make sure that the family's money kept going to the people who had been financially dependent on the deceased. Even though Clara and Mauvais were legally adults, their history of being alone and seeming mentally weak could be used to argue that they still need protection and supervision. Through middlemen and carefully written legal papers, Alistair began to set up a guardianship arrangement that would put the Blackwood estate in the hands of a court-appointed trustee. This trustee would know exactly what was going on with the sisters and put their needs ahead of making money. It was hard to get through the local legal system, which had been corrupted by decades of Blackwood influence. But Alistair was able to raise concerns about the sisters' ability to take care of themselves after their parents' traumatic disappearance because he was the family's doctor. More immediately, he started to use his medical practice to help fix some of the problems in the system that had allowed the Blackwood family to terrorize people. For generations, the sharecroppers who worked on the plantation had not been able to get the medical care they needed. Their health problems were ignored or thought to be normal for people in their situation. Alistair began to visit the plantation quarters on a regular basis, supposedly to check on the health of workers who might be worried about what would happen to their employer, but really to give them the kind of full medical care they had never had before. These visits showed him things that shocked even his northern sensibilities. Kids with diseases that could have been avoided, adults with injuries that weren't being treated, and families living in buildings that barely qualified as shelter. The community had been taught to expect nothing better, so they accepted all of this as the natural order of things. Alistair started to write down these conditions with the same level of detail he had used to look into the Blackwood mystery, but this time his goal was to make a case for systematic reform instead of criminal prosecution. He was also able to learn more about the sisters' current situation without directly talking to them by working with the sharecroppers. At first, the plantation workers were wary of any white doctor's motives, but they slowly began to trust him as he stayed around and showed that he cared about their well-being. He learned that Clara and Mauvais had started to come out of their shell after their parents went missing by asking them questions that sounded like taking a medical history. They had even started walking around the plantation and talking to some of the workers. These reports made Alistair cautiously hopeful that things would get better over time. It seems that the sisters were starting to get back to some normal human interactions, pushing the limits of a freedom they had never known before. People had seen Clara reading to some of the workers' kids. Her cultured education had finally found a useful outlet after years of being used against her own growth. Maeve was interested in the medicinal plants that some of the older women grew. Maybe her broken mind found stability in the concrete realities of traditional healing practices. After weeks of careful thought and planning, they decided to make one last trip to the Blackwood mansion. Alistair knew that his last fight with the sisters had been hard on everyone, but he didn't care about their well-being. He just wanted answers. This time, he didn't go to them as an investigator looking for the truth. Instead, he went to them as a doctor caring for patients who had been through unimaginable trauma. He found them in the mansion's conservatory, a room with glass walls, where Jebediah used to care for rare plants that were now dying because no one was taking care of them. Clara sat at an old piano and played notes that sounded more haunting than musical. Maeve took care of the plants that were still alive with great care. When he walked in, both women looked up, but their faces didn't show any of the fear or anger that had been there the last time they met. Instead, Alistair saw something that might have been curiosity, as if they were finally ready to find out what kind of relationship they could have with someone who knew their secrets but didn't use them against them. The talk that came after was unlike anything Alistair had ever had in his work or personal life. They didn't talk about what would happen to their parents or the proof of their crimes. Instead, they talked about the future, slowly and carefully at first, but with more and more confidence, as they realized that Alistair had come to help them instead of judge them. Clara said she wanted to use her education to help the children of the plantation workers. Maeve said she wanted to learn more about healing plants and how to use them. These were the first real personal goals that either sister had ever been allowed to say out loud. Their emergence was a big step in their recovery from a lifetime of being systematically silenced. When Alistair was finally ready to leave, he gave them something that no one else in their lives had ever given them: the chance to choose. He talked about the legal arrangements he was trying to set up, the protections he was trying to put in place, and the support systems he wanted to make. But he made it clear that all of these things depended on their agreement. They would have the final say in how their lives went from then on. He might have given two women who had never been able to make their own choices the most valuable gift of all: the ability to make decisions about their own lives. Alistair felt a deep sense of completion as he walked away from the Blackwood mansion for what he knew would be the last time. This had nothing to do with solving mysteries or getting justice in any normal way. He had found something more valuable and rare instead: the chance to be saved by protection instead of punishment, to heal by being given power instead of being exposed, and to find peace by accepting moral problems that couldn't be solved easily. The sisters would always have their scars and secrets, but they would be free women instead of victims. That change was the only real justice that mattered.